Portugal said this land belonged to the crown, but for decades, every road into these mountains told a different story. Because up there in the forests of Brazil, the enslaved did not just escape, they built a power that the empire could not erase. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore. From Latin America's history to mysteries, true crime, and local legends, Latin intrigue whispers here. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. At dawn, the road up Serra da Barriga looks almost innocent. Wet leaves, thin mist, a slope any mule could climb. Yet for decades, that road embarrassed an empire. Men marched up with muskets, orders, and map-driven confidence, thinking control was simple. Again and again, the mountains sent them back hungry, bleeding, and ashamed. So what waited above, making imperial power look fragile? The easy story claims a lost black kingdom hid here. The colonial story says it was a den of thieves. Both miss the point. In the 17th century, between present-day Alagoas and Pernambuco, escaped and free black people built Quilombo dos Palmares not just for survival, but as a confederated maroon power that challenged and legitimized itself against the empire. And that is the mystery worth following. How do people who were hunted as property become organizers, farmers, scouts, diplomats, rulers, and defenders of a world of their own? How does a place born of flight stop being a refuge and become a government? Palmares did not last by vanishing like smoke. It lasted by doing the hardest thing freedom has ever had to do. It learned how to stay. It learned how to turn escape into structure and structure into survival. To understand why Quilombo dos Palmares mattered, you have to leave the mountain and move toward Brazil's sugar coast. Pernambuco was a giant sugar producer in the Atlantic world. Sugar left the mills and made fortunes abroad, but the plantations ran on slavery chains. Exhaustion, disease, and terror held the system together. Sugar looked elegant on distant tables, but up close, it tasted of suffering. Every plantation tried to look like an order. Every plantation also taught enslaved people to notice guards, escape routes, and chances to flee. Timing played a role too. In the 17th century, northeastern Brazil was shaken by wars between the Dutch and the Portuguese. Whenever empires are busy fighting over ports, taxes, and pride, the people at the bottom notice the cracks first. Surveillance weakens. Plantations burn. Soldiers march elsewhere. Jurisdictions blur. Enslaved people ran in the confusion. Palmares grew inside that opening. War did not create freedom by itself, but war gave freedom room to breathe, and Palmares knew what to do with that breath. Now climb again. Leave the coast behind as you push upward. The air changes. The road narrows. Trees press close. Ravines open beside your feet. Up there, Serra da Barriga was not magic, but it was cruel to outsiders. Elevation gave a warning. Forest cover swallowed movement. Paths made sense only to those who had learned them in fear and memory. The mountain did not build Palmares alone. Geography is never enough. But it gave the fugitives something that every new society needs above all else, a defensible body. Palmares was not just a hidden village, but a network or constellation of mocambos, or settlements joined by kin, need, leadership, and mutual defense. Many hearths, gardens, and watch posts. A strong center, but also a flexible body, absorbing attack and resisting colonial control. An enemy in a single camp can be destroyed in an afternoon. A society spread over several settlements presents a different problem. Burn one clearing and survivors scatter. Attack one stockade and another ridge sends word. Kill some and others plant again. Palmares had depth. Families, children, elders, fighters, healers, cooks enough people that damage did not become disappearance. Only then did the colony realize it was not hunting strays, but confronting continuity. Who lived there? Black fugitives were the core, but the population was broader than a clean, overseas origin story. Afro-Brazilians born into slavery, later freed people, indigenous allies and neighbors, and others from the frontier of war and hunger. That diversity brought planting, trails, war, and insight into colonial minds. Palmares had to make strangers into people. That is why leadership mattered. Large communities could not hold together on courage alone. Someone had to settle disputes, move fighters, distribute labor, watch the roads, and decide when to bargain or bleed. Even enemy records, though warped, admit to a structure they could not ignore. Palmares commanded, punished, relocated, and negotiated. That was not the language of a camp. It was the language of rule, even if it never looked like a modern office with desks and seals. But before muskets and rulers, there is a simpler question. How did Palmares eat? That is the question fantasy versions skip, because food sounds less glamorous than battle. But food is the real miracle. Freedom that cannot feed itself dies a heroic, swift death. The freedom that plants like manioc, beans, and maize offer is that they help people think in terms of seasons rather than hours. The evidence left behind points to cultivated staples, hunting, gathering, and routines enough to keep people alive. A free world is built in kitchens and gardens long before it is remembered in legend. Raids were necessary, weapons seized, supplies taken, captives liberated. However, a society of thousands could not live solely by raiding, despite colonial slander. Instead, Palmares thrived by blending rescue with planting, risk with stability, and attack with daily life. This careful balance brought permanence and made Palmares a true rival. There was trade. The frontier was not closed. Settlers, peddlers, indigenous groups, plantation workers, and smugglers moved goods and information in and out. Palmares, while independent, exchanged flour, tools, warnings, and rumors across unclear boundaries. A maroon society that could feed itself and interact with the frontier economy posed a serious threat to colonial control. Now we can talk about war properly. Palmares did not defeat colonial armies by lining up in neat ranks and pretending the battlefield was fair. Its genius was asymmetry. The mountain, the forest, and the road fought too. Outsiders entered bad terrain with long supply lines, poor visibility, and the sickening sense that every branch could be watching them. Palmares fought with knowledge before it fought with steel. Distance, exhaustion, confusion, and fear became weapons. In this way, the balance between environment and strategy was what crippled invaders. Information mattered almost as much as terrain. A column leaves the coast. Someone sees, someone carries the word, someone listens, hears boots, notices movement. News travels differently when people defend their home. Colonial expeditions often arrived as expected. An unexpected enemy is already wounded. Imagine realizing, after days of marching to surprise a town, that they have prepared for you since before dawn. The mountain seems steeper after that. Some centers were fortified. Records mention palisades and defensive layouts, especially at Macaco. Not golden towers, just wood, earth, and labor organized for defense. The layout declared, "We expect an attack and plan to survive." Macaco was the heart. Liberation was Palmares' core act of resistance. Each escape was not just military. It was a powerful statement that freedom could be real, communal, and permanent. Arrivals did not weaken Palmares, they proved its promise and taught the colony that freedom was a living, growing presence, not merely a rumor. Campaign after campaign failed against Palmares. It did not survive through gentlest empires crush weakness, but by turning imperial weakness into strength. Colonial plans were sloppy, officials quarreled, the terrain was brutal, and supply lines stretched thin. Commanders underestimated those they called inferior. Each defeat taught Palmares to adapt, and each loss exposed the empire's limits. That is where the name Ganga Zumba emerges from the archive. The record treats him as a principal ruler, especially associated with Macaco. And that matters. Empires do not negotiate with ghosts. They negotiate with power. However distorted the sources may be, they preserve one loud truth. Palmares had leadership serious enough that colonial authorities could not dismiss it as random banditry. A voice from the mountain could force a reply from the governor. That alone tells you this was not a hideout. It was a political actor. And then the story turns, because war is not the only language of power. In 1678, colonial authorities offered peace terms to Ganga Zumba. Hear the confession hidden inside that gesture. A regime that had long described runaways as criminals suddenly sat down to bargain. That is not mercy. That is recognition. It means force had not solved the problem. Palmares had survived long enough that negotiation looked less embarrassing than endless failure. The road up Serra da Barriga had at last become a road to diplomacy, marking a new phase. But peace in a slave society always arrives with poison folded into the paper. The offer promised freedom for those born in Palmares and relocation under Portuguese oversight. Later, many followers of Ganga Zumba were moved toward Cuckoo under that arrangement. Listen to the trick. Freedom for some, supervision for all, relocation dressed up as recognition. And what about new fugitives still running from plantations? What about the wider confederation? A deal like that can sound humane in a governor's chamber and feel like a trap on the mountain. This is where Zumbi rises into the story with all the force later memory would give him. But let us keep the moment human before turning it into bronze. The dispute was not a simple hero versus coward. It was an argument over survival. Some may have seen negotiation as breathing room. Others saw a noose hidden inside the handshake. If freedom came only for those already born inside Palmares, then the road closed behind them. New fugitives would be abandoned, and colonial oversight would begin to rot autonomy from within. That is why Zumbi's refusal mattered, not just as heroic pride, though later generations would remember him that way, but as cold realism. A partial peace inside a still functioning slave empire was not secure freedom. It threatened the foundation that kept Palmares alive: open refuge, collective defense, and independence of action. And notice what this disagreement reveals. Palmares was not a fairy realm of perfect unity. It argued, it calculated, it feared betrayal. Freedom that lasts for decades is built on hard choices made under the threat of annihilation. The colony learned something from that failed settlement, too. Palmares could be fought, yes, but it could also bargain, delay, test intentions, and split colonial elites' opinions. Diplomacy was one more weapon in its arsenal. It bought time, it probed weakness, it forced recognition. Yet diplomacy also revealed the system's limit. Plantation society could not truly tolerate a durable, autonomous black confederation inside its body. Temporary arrangements might happen. Permanent acceptance could not. Palmares was intolerable not because it was violent, but because it was viable. Now we need to step carefully into a more complicated room. People sometimes want Palmares to be perfect because the violence against it was monstrous. But no society under siege survives on innocence alone. It needs rules, labor, discipline, and ways of settling conflicts. Some hostile accounts suggest that Palmares could be hierarchical and at times harsh within. A few suggest dependents or captives in forms of unfreedom. The archive here is crooked and cannot be handled carelessly, but it warns us against turning Palmares into a spotless dream. That warning matters, not because it weakens Palmares, but because it helps us understand its true achievement. Plantation slavery was an engine built to turn human beings into property for profit. Palmares was a black-led society built by people who rejected that fate and over time tried to keep one another outside that machinery. Those are not equal worlds. But freedom has politics inside it. Under siege, even noble communities centralize power, demand labor, and punish dissent. Palmares was powerful because it organized life, not because it floated above conflict. The cultural world of Palmares survives only in fragments, yet fragments can still sing. The people there likely braided Central African inheritances, Afro-Brazilian practices, frontier improvisation, Catholic contact, and indigenous knowledge into something lived and local. Naming, ritual, healing, spiritual protection, leadership, and memory helped turn a diverse population into a community. So no, Palmares was not an untouched African kingdom preserved in tropical glass, but neither was it a blank New World invention. It was something harder to classify and more impressive for that very reason. A society made from collision, adaptation, and shared danger. That is part of why the old fantasy versions fail. Some people want mystery so badly that they erase intelligence. They imagine a lost kingdom because they cannot accept that fugitives, farmers, mothers, scouts, and fighters built durable governance with the materials history handed them. Others reduce Palmares to criminality for the same reason. They cannot stand the possibility that the enslaved did not merely resist, they founded, they administered, they made another center of belonging in the Americas. And that, more than romance, is why the colony feared Palmares so deeply. At the labor level, it pulled people away from plantations and weakened discipline. At the military level, it absorbed men, weapons, and money for decades. At the symbolic level, it proved black autonomy could scale. At the territorial level, it turned claimed imperial land into contested ground. A governor can point at a map and call it his, but a map does not make the road obey. For years, the road obeyed Palmares more than the crown. By the 1690s, though, the colony began to change its approach. Earlier campaigns had often been sloppy, divided, or naive about the terrain. Now authorities leaned harder into specialists in brutal frontier warfare, men used to the difficult backlands and uninterested in elegance. Not an improvement, it was an escalation. The colony was learning how much concentrated violence it would take to break what Palmares had built. The long war was entering a darker, more methodical phase, and the mountain could feel it. One name stands over that phase like a stain: Domingos Jorge Velho. He was useful to the colonial authorities precisely because frontier warfare had already carved the softness out of him. Under his campaigns and those of allied colonial forces, pressure on Palmares became harsher, broader, and more sustained. Not mean Palmares suddenly became weak. It means the empire finally assembled a costlier combination of logistics, experience, and will. Weak targets are crushed casually. Palmares had to be hunted with unusual dedication because the usual measures had failed. Then came the blow that still echoes through the archive. In 1694, Macaco fell after a siege and assault. That was not the instant disappearance of everything Palmares had been, but it was a decisive strike against its central political infrastructure, against the heart that had kept the Confederation beating. The road that had so often shamed invaders finally delivered them somewhere they had wanted to reach for years. Colonial victory came late, expensive, and soaked in the admission that Palmares had never been a minor problem. Even then, the story did not end in one clean colonial sentence. Zumbi continued resistance after the fall of Macaco, and his death in 1695 became the wound through which memory kept speaking. Later, Brazil, especially Afro-Brazilian historical consciousness, would raise his name like a banner, and not without reason. He came to embody refusal, dignity, and the knowledge that a bad peace can become a slower captivity. Before he became a symbol, he was already something sharper, a leader who judged autonomy safer than promises from slave power. Some embers burned even after that. Palmares-linked resistance did not vanish the same day Macaco fell, and later traces continue to point to surviving fragments in the hills. Some accounts follow those remnants into the early 18th century, with Musa remembered as one of the last Mocambos, lasting until around 1714. Whether we stress that final date hard or lightly, the larger truth remains. Destruction was a process, not a switch. A society spread through many lives does not disappear all at once when one stronghold burns. So why did destruction finally become possible? Not because Palmares had been an illusion, the opposite. It took intensified logistics, specialized fighters, coordinated pressure, and repeated operations to break it. That ending confirms Palmares rather than shrinking it. Weak things are erased casually. Palmares was not erased casually. The colony had to concentrate extraordinary violence to wound it fatally. And even then, the very difficulty of the victory became part of Palmares' legacy. It left the empire looking powerful but also exposed. Now let us clear away the myths that arise after the smoke. One myth says Palmares was a secret lost kingdom hidden outside history, as if freedom descended from the trees fully formed and untouched by the world. Beautiful image. Wrong lesson. Palmares was deeply entangled with plantation society, frontier exchange, war, and colonial politics. Its genius was not vanishing from history. Its genius was forcing history to come deal with it, again and again, on ground chosen by people the empire claimed should never have governed anything. Another myth paints Palmares as a flawless egalitarian paradise, with no hierarchy, no tension, no arguments, no hard choices. That version means well, but it robs Palmares of its dignity. Units under siege argue. Real leaders disagree. Real survival requires labor, discipline, and structures that can both chafe and protect. Palmares does not need to be polished into innocence to be magnificent. It is already magnificent because it converted desperation into a durable collective life under conditions designed to make such a life impossible. Then there is the oldest lie, the colonial one, still muttering after all these years, that Palmares was just a nest of thieves and barbarians. No, that language was always trying to hide the obvious. Palmares governed the people. It defended territory. It fed households. It negotiated. It mobilized fighters across settlements. It reproduced itself over time. Criminal is what the empire calls the person who refuses to remain legible as property. Barbarian is what power whispers when the people it despises start beating it at the practical arts of survival. Seen clearly, Palmares belongs to a larger American story. Across the hemisphere, maroon worlds rose where slavery tried to seal every exit and failed, in Jamaica, in Suriname, in Saint Domingue, in places whose names did not always enter school books with the respect they deserved. But Palmares stands apart for scale, duration, and political depth. It shows that resistance to slavery was not only revolt or escape, it could also become rival governance, another center of rule and belonging built by the formerly unfree. That is why it matters beyond Brazil. Go back one more time to the road up Serra da Barriga. At first glance, it is only mud, leaves, slope, and silence. But now you know what the empire kept climbing toward, not simply armed fugitives, not simply rage. It was climbing toward kitchens, gardens, sentries, bargains, rituals, debates, and the patient architecture of a free black society teaching itself how to endure. That is what slave worlds fear most. Not the cry of refusal alone, but the infrastructure that turns refusal into continuity. And that is why the title needs to be spoken with care. Portugal and colonial forces destroyed Palmares in the end, but only after decades of failure, negotiation, humiliation, and extraordinary violence. The deeper truth is not indestructibility. The deeper truth is duration. A people, the law called property, made themselves governable from within and terribly difficult to govern from without. That is the scandal Palmares offered the Atlantic world. Not fantasy, not a miracle, competence, discipline, memory, and a freedom stubborn enough to survive long past expectation. So when someone calls Palmares a hidden kingdom, pause them. Hidden from whom? Not from the captives who ran toward it, not from the governors who kept sending men to break it, not from the land, which still keeps the receipts. Palmares was not hidden, it was inconveniently alive. It lived loudly enough to force an empire into argument with the people it tried to reduce to cargo. And even after the stockades fell, the argument did not end. It moved into memory, ritual, politics, and the unfinished language of freedom. Maybe that is why Zumbi still stands so tall in memory, and why Ganga Zumba should stand beside him. One came to symbolize refusal. The other reminds us that leadership under siege is also negotiation, risk, compromise, and the terrible burden of choosing among bad options. Between them, we see not a legend carved in one piece, but politics alive inside freedom's experiment. Palmares becomes richer when we let both men remain human in the story, because human decisions are exactly what made the mountain so dangerous to the empire. In the end, Palmares leaves us with a harder kind of wonder. Not the wonder of treasure maps and secret crowns, but the wonder that people uprooted by atrocity could build fields, kinship, defenses, ritual life, and law in the teeth of an empire. That kind of wonder does not ask us to daydream. It asks us to respect labor, memory, and the intelligence required to keep a free society alive for even one season, let alone decades, under permanent threat. That is a harder, more durable beauty. The road is still there, the mountain is still there, the question is still there too. What really defeated imperial certainty for so long on those wet slopes? Not invisibility, not magic, not myth. It was governance with roots in hunger, courage, and shared necessity. It was people who understood that freedom must be planted, guarded, argued over, and rebuilt after every fire. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.